when Mark Holloway, a 34-year-old paramedic, pulled into the driveway of 1428 Sycamore Lane. He expected another routine call, maybe a senior who had slipped in the kitchen or a panicked parent worried over a child's fever. But as he killed the engine and reached for his gear, something about the house made him pause. The porch light flickered weakly, casting irregular shadows over the peeling pane of the front door. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. Mark was used to late-night calls, but there was usually some ambient noise, a distant dog barking, the hum of a television through a thin apartment wall. Tonight, though, the air sat unnervingly still. He glanced at the dispatch notes on his tablet. Caller hung up before providing details. Possible distress. No further information available. Mark frowned. Hang-ups weren't uncommon, but they usually involved scared kids or pranksters. Something about this one, though, gnawed at him. He grabbed his radio. Unit 3 on scene. No contact yet. Static, then a crackle response. Copy that, Unit 3. PD is en route, but no ETA. Great. That meant he was going alone. Mark stepped out of the rig, boots crunching over gravel. He approached the door and knocked twice. Silence. Then, just as he was about to knock again, a sound, faint, muffled, a shuffling noise, like furniture scraping over hardwood. His pulse picked up. "Hello," he called. "This is EMS. Did someone call for help?" Another sound, this time a breathy exhale, almost a sigh. Mark's gut tightened. He'd seen enough to trust his instincts, and right now, they were screaming at him. Something was wrong. Mark Holloway wasn't the kind of man who sought out danger. He hadn't joined the paramedics for the thrill of flashing lights and high-speed responses. He wasn't chasing heroism or adrenaline. He had chosen this life for one simple reason: to help people, born and raised in the quiet town of Fairhaven. Mark had always been the dependable one, the kid who stayed behind after football practice to help the coach clean up, the guy who volunteered to walk an elderly neighbor's dog after her hip surgery. He wasn't the loudest or the most charming, but people trusted him. Mark showed up. His path to emergency medicine hadn't been glamorous. No defining tragedy had steered him here, just a quiet, persistent desire to make himself useful. He had started as an EMT straight out of high school, taking shift that bled into the early morning, eating gas station sandwiches between calls. He worked his way up, studied hard, and eventually earned his paramedic license. 14 years in the field, and he'd seen just about everything: car wrecks, overdoses, heart attacks in grocery store aisles, calls that ended in life-saving victories, calls that didn't. He learned to carry the weight of both. Mark didn't see himself as special, just necessary. In a small town like Fairhaven, he wasn't just a responder. He was a neighbor. He knew the people he helped. The barista who burned her hand on a steamer wand, that was Jenna, who always remembered his order. The elderly man who collapsed in the park last summer, Mr. Calloway, who still waved at him from his front porch. Mark wasn't a faceless uniform here. He was part of the fabric of the town. That connection made the job both easier and harder. Easier because people trusted him. They let him in when they might hesitate with someone else. They calmed under his steady voice. Harder because the losses stayed with him. It wasn't just another patient when a call went bad. It was someone's grandfather, someone's sister, someone whose name he knew. But Mark never let himself dwell too long. He couldn't afford to. He had a job to do, and dwelling on the past didn't save lives. His routine was as steady as he was. 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. He'd wake up before dawn, drink coffee strong enough to cut through the exhaustion, and head to the station. He and his partner, Jason, would check the rig, joke about quitting to start a food truck, and wait for the first call. They saw the town at its best and its worst, from the quiet beauty of sunrise over Main Street to the chaos of a multi-car pileup on the highway. At the end of the day, Mark would go home to his small apartment, where the only light came from the fish tank in the corner. He'd feed the fish, shower off the day, and collapse into bed, only to do it all again tomorrow. He didn't mind the repetition. In fact, he liked it. The job was unpredictable, but his role in it wasn't. He was the one people called when things went wrong. And when Mark pulled up to 1428 Sycamore Lane that night, he had no idea just how wrong things were about to get. Mark's knuckles hovered over the door for a moment before he knocked again, firmer this time. Still no response. But he heard something. A faint, rhythmic creaking, like a chair swaying slightly, shifting under weight. It was the kind of sound that wouldn't register as strange under normal circumstances. But in the eerie stillness of his house, with no voice responding, no footsteps approaching the door, it crawled under Mark's skin. He tried the handle. Locked. Mark exhaled slowly. There were procedures for this. He wasn't a cop. He couldn't just force his way in. But if someone was in medical distress, waiting wasn't an option. He stepped back and scanned the windows. The porch light flickered again, casting a distorted shadow over the bay window to the right of the door. Behind the glass, the curtains were drawn, but they weren't fully shut. A sliver of the interior was visible. Mark shifted, angling his head to get a better view inside. And that's when he saw it. A hand, motionless, dangling limply over the armrest of a chair, just barely visible through the gap in the curtains. Mark's pulse kicked up. "Hello," he called again, sharper now. "I see you in there. If you need help, I'm coming in." Still nothing. Not even the rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Mark turned back to the door, jaw tightening. He had to get inside. He moved quickly to the side of the house, his boots crunching softly over damp grass. The backyard was unkempt, overgrown, forgotten, but his focus locked on a small back door. He tried the knob. Unlocked. Mark hesitated only for a second before pushing it open. The door creaked, a slow, protesting sound that sent a shiver through him. He stepped inside, immediately met by the scent of something stale. Not quite rotting, but old, like air trapped too long in a space where no one had moved. His flashlight cut through the dimness, sweeping over an outdated kitchen. The sink was full of dishes, water stains crusted onto plates. A chair sat overturned near the small dining table. Mark's gut twisted. He moved forward, cautious but quick, stepping to the narrow hallway leading to the living room. The creaking sound grew louder. That rhythmic, unsettling noise. Then a voice. Soft, strained, coming from just ahead. "You shouldn't have come." Mark froze. The voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even loud. But something about it, low, tired, almost resigned, sent a cold current down his spine. His flashlight beam landed on the chair. The hand was still there, still dangling, and the person attached to it was staring right at him. Mark's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight beam fixed on the figure in the chair. A man mid-50s, pale and gaunt, sat slumped, his wrists draped limply over the armrest. His clothes were wrinkled and disheveled, like he had been wearing them for days. But it was his eyes that sent a ripple of unease through Mark's chest. Wide, unblinking, fixed on him. "Sir, can you hear me?" Mark took a cautious step forward, lowering his voice to a measured calm. "I'm a paramedic. I got a call from this address. Are you the one who called 911? The man didn't answer. He barely even blinked. His mouth twitched slightly, as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Then Mark saw it, the rise and fall of his chest. It was slow, too slow. Mark clicked his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3. I have a male subject, mid-50s, conscious but non-responsive. Possible medical emergency, low respiration. Do we have an ETA on law enforcement?" A crackle of static. Then, negative, Unit 3. Officers still tied up on another call. "What's your status?" Mark glanced at the man, whose breath hitched unevenly. "Still assessing," he muttered. "Stand by." He took another step closer, scanning the room as he did. The house was eerily still, but something felt off. Not just the man's condition, the space itself. Mark had been in hundreds of homes before, responding to all kinds of calls. Most people had clutter, pictures on the walls, half-empty coffee mugs, a TV humming in the background. But this house was stagnant. The air was thick, like it hadn't been disturbed in a long time. There was no smell of cooking, no faint trace of soap or detergent, just that strange, stale scent, like a place left untouched. The only thing that seemed recent was a chair the man sat in and a small, neat table beside it, and that rhythmic creaking. Mark realized the sound wasn't coming from the chair. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the house. A slow, repetitive shift of weight. Mark's pulse ticked higher. His gut twisted with an instinct honed from years on the job. Something was wrong here. He refocused on the man. "Sir, are you alone in the house?" The man blinked once. Then, so faintly Mark almost missed it, he shook his head. Mark's muscles coiled tight. "Not alone." He forced his voice to remain steady. "Is someone else here? Are they hurt?" The man's lips parted slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Shouldn't have come." A slow chill worked its way down Mark's spine. "Sir, I need to check the rest of the house. If someone else is here, they might need help." The man's gaze snapped to him, sudden and intense. His fingers twitched against the armrest. His lips parted again, but instead of words, a shuddering breath escaped. Then footsteps, not from the front door, from the hallway behind him. Mark turned sharply, his flashlight swinging toward the darkened corridor. The beam barely cut through the thick shadows, but he felt it, movement, a faint shift, the almost imperceptible sound of weight settling on an old floorboard. Mark's grip tightened around his flashlight. His training told him to retreat, to wait for law enforcement. But his instincts told him that whoever was standing in that darkness wasn't waiting. He was being watched. For the first time in years, Mark felt something rare and unsettling twist in his gut. Fear. He turned back to the man in the chair. "Who else is here?" The man's breath shuddered again. His fingers twitched once more against the armrest. And then, barely above a whisper, he spoke. "It doesn't like the light." Mark barely had time to process the words before the creaking stopped. Silence. Then, a sharp, deliberate click. The sound of the back door locking. Mark's blood ran cold. Someone else was in the house, and they didn't want him to leave. Mark's heart slammed against his ribs. The back door, locked. Someone had done it deliberately. The air inside the house had shifted, thick with something unspoken, unseen, but undeniably there. His fingers hovered over his radio, but instinct told him something. Someone was watching, listening. The man in the chair exhaled, a slow, rattling breath. "You should go." Mark swallowed hard. "I can't do that, sir." His flashlight flickered slightly as he swept it toward the hallway again. He had to make a choice, get out or go deeper. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to wait for backup, but the way this man was slumped, barely breathing, the way he kept speaking in half-whispers, warnings tangled in exhaustion, someone needed help. And Mark had never walked away from a patient before. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step toward the hallway. If someone was here, he needed to find them. The floor groaned beneath his boots. Mark kept his breathing steady as he scanned the darkness ahead. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. His flashlight traced over the first. A bathroom. Empty. The next. A bedroom. Stripped bare except for an old mattress. No signs of life. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Not the old man's voice. Mark's skin prickled. He turned toward the last door at the end of the hall. Half open. Swallowed by shadows. The whispering stopped. Mark tightened his grip on his flashlight. His free hand hovered near his radio again, but before he could speak, the door slammed shut. Mark jumped. His pulse hammered his ears. The sound echoed through the empty house, sharp and final. Something wasn't right here. His brain raced through the possibilities. Was this a home invasion? A hostage situation? A delusional or dangerous person barricading themselves inside? Whatever it was, the old man in the chair was terrified of it. Mark hesitated only for a moment. Then, drawing a slow breath, he stepped forward and reached for the doorknob. It wasn't locked. He braced himself and pushed the door open. His flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating. Nothing. The room was empty. No furniture. No movement. No signs of anyone inside. Mark exhaled sharply, his grip loosening slightly. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe something grabbed his wrist. Mark spun. His flashlight jerked wildly, sweeping over the open doorway, the old man. He was standing, trembling, gripping Mark's wrist with strength that didn't match his frail appearance. His fingers were ice cold, his nails pressing into Mark's skin. "Don't." The old man's voice was desperate now, his sunken eyes wild with fear. "It's still here. It's always here." Mark swallowed, his mind racing. "Sir, we need to get you out of here." The man shook his head violently. "You don't understand." His grip tightened, and his voice dropped to a whisper. "It's waiting. It doesn't like the light." Mark's stomach twisted. He needed to get them both out. Now! But before he could move, the lights in the entire house went out. The flashlight flickered, and the whispering started again. The flashlight flickered again, its weak beam barely holding against the suffocating darkness. Mark's breath came fast and shallow. The old man's grip was still tight on his wrist, his fingers trembling but strong. The whispering, that unnatural, rhythmic whispering, had returned, weaving through the blackness like a presence of its own. But Mark refused to freeze. He had to act. He yanked his arm free, shifting so he stood protectively in front of the old man. His training screamed at him, assess, secure, evacuate. Whoever, or whatever, was here. It wasn't stopping him from getting this man out. "Stay close to me," Mark instructed, his voice low but firm. The old man didn't argue. His breath hitched with fear, but he nodded. Mark moved quickly, guiding him back toward the living room, back toward the front door. But the whispering, it didn't stay behind them. It moved with them. Mark's skin crawled. His flashlight dimmed, the batteries struggling as the air thickened, pressing down on them with invisible weight. And then, from the darkness ahead, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the front door. Mark's breath caught. His instinct screamed at him to turn around, to bolt the back door instead. But it was locked. He needed another way. Then his radio crackled to life. "Unit 3, law enforcement en route. What's your status?" Hope surged in Mark's chest. He grabbed his radio, pushing down the panic clawing at his throat. "Dispatch! I need immediate backup. Something is in this house. Possible intruder. Lights are out. I have a distressed subject. We are evacuating now." Static. Then ETA for minutes. For minutes. Too long. Mark didn't wait. He pulled the old man toward the nearest window, reaching for the latch. But it wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder, closer. A deep, gnawing instinct twisted in Mark's gut. The air in the house felt thick, almost alive. Every part of him screamed that whatever lurked in the dark was watching, waiting. But he refused to stop, refused to give in. "Hold on to me. Sir, we're getting out of here." He grabbed the nearest chair and swung hard at the window. The glass shattered with an explosive crack, shards raining onto the floor. Fresh, cool night air flooded in. Mark turned to the old man. "Go. Now." The old man hesitated for just a second, his sunken eyes filled with fear. Then he moved, crawling through the window with Mark right behind him. As soon as they tumbled onto the lawn, the whispering stopped. Silence. Mark twisted around, flashlight sweeping over the broken window. The darkness inside the house was unnatural, absolute. It seemed to press against the shattered glass, as if reluctant to let them go. Then, slowly, the front door creaked open. Mark's breath hitched. He trained his flashlight toward the threshold. Nothing. Just the gaping blackness, waiting. Then came the faintest movement. A shadow shifting just beyond the frame. Not stepping forward. Not retreating. Just watching. Sirens wailed in the distance. Flashing red and blue lights flooded the street. The moment the first officer stepped onto the lawn, Mark finally let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. 2 deputies rushed toward him. "Paramedic, you okay? Who else is in the house?" Mark shook his head, his chest still heaving. "I don't know, but something's in there." The officers exchanged a glance, then drew their weapons. "Stay with him. We'll clear the house." Mark turned to the old man, who was collapsed on the grass, shaking but alive. His sunken eyes met Mark's, and for the first time they softened. "You shouldn't have come," the old man whispered. "But thank you for not leaving." Mark swallowed, his throat tight. He had almost walked away. He had almost let fear win. But in the end, he hadn't. The officers moved into the house, their flashlights cutting through the dark. But even as they disappeared inside, Mark knew they wouldn't find anyone, because whatever had been in that house wasn't meant to be seen. The next day, Mark found himself sitting beside the old man's hospital bed. His vitals had stabilized. Doctors said he was severely dehydrated, malnourished, but he would recover. Mark leaned forward. "What happened in that house? Who locked the door?" The old man sighed, staring at his hands. "It wasn't locked. Not for them. Just for us." Mark's stomach turned. "Who is them?" The old man didn't answer for a long time. Then he simply said, "I don't live there anymore." Mark exhaled slowly. He didn't push. He didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be understood. But one thing was clear. If he hadn't listened, if he had ignored his instincts, walked away, left the old man behind, he never would have forgiven himself. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what we see. It's what we ignore. Stay aware. Stay compassionate. Because you never know when someone needs you to listen. The lesson we take away. Sometimes the most terrifying things in life aren't what we can see, but what we choose to ignore. Mark could have walked away. He could have written off the old man's fear as confusion, dismissed the unease as paranoia, and ignored the warning signs pressing at the edge of his instincts. But he didn't. He listened. In our busy lives, it's easy to pass by the things that don't demand our immediate attention. A neighbor who hasn't been seen in days. A friend who seems a little off, but insists they're fine. A stranger standing alone, hesitant, as if waiting for someone to notice them. How often do we tell ourselves it's not our place to interfere, that someone else will step in? But what if no one does? What if that one moment, one small act of kindness, vigilance, or intervention makes all the difference? The truth is, we all have the power to save someone in ways we may never fully understand. It might not always be as dramatic as a haunted house or an urgent 911 call, but sometimes the simple act of paying attention, of reaching out, can change or even save a life. Be aware. Be compassionate. Be the person who listens when no one else does. Because the real horror in life isn't what lurks in the dark. It's when we turn away from those who need us most. If this story made you think, let us know in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where following your gut made a difference? Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always remember, sometimes the scariest thing is doing nothing at all.